Welcome to Better Without Billboards. I'm James, and on today's episode we're zooming out to look at the role advertising plays in the economy at large. Our economy, as we know, is a capitalist one, and the role of advertising at first seems simple enough: to promote things and make us want to buy them. And this is true, but as we'll hear, advertising also plays a deeper role in promoting capitalism itself, in normalizing the practices and values that make capitalism possible. Later we'll think about what advertising might do or look like in an economy beyond capitalism, one characterized by principles of what's known as degrowth, or alternatively post-growth. Helping me understand this is Simon Mair, lecturer in sustainability at the University of York. Last year, Simon authored an article called Language, Climate Change and Cities Beyond Capitalism in the Journal of City Climate Policy and Economy, which offered a degrowth critique of advertising. And we refer to that article a few times throughout the podcast, and you can find a link to it in the show notes. Simon began the article with the idea of what he calls growth with a capital G as the kind of central tenet of capitalism. So I started our conversation by asking Simon to explain exactly what this means and the role that advertising plays in growth with a capital G.
So growth with a capital G is, I guess it's to distinguish this idea of economic growth from other kinds of growth that operate differently and maybe are not as bad or are desirable. Because I think growth is a big kind of narrative in our societies, but like it can mean lots of many different things. So, you might think about personal growth or spiritual growth or, growth of plants or animals or humans. We all physically grow over time. I mean, I've stopped growing vertically and I am sort of slowly growing horizontally, but that's not the point. The point is that growth with a capital G is a specific kind of growth. So it's growth in the size of the economy measured principally in kind of monetary terms. So this is something, particularly in the UK at the moment, we hear an awful lot about because it's kind of the central pillar of the Labour Party's policy. They say we want to grow, we want to get back to growth. And what they mean is we want to produce more stuff, sell more stuff, make more money. So does that make sense? That's growth with a capital G.
Okay.
And that it's a kind of a narrative that you find in lots of different places. So it's really like the systematic pursuit of making more money. So you might call it like chasing profit or like accumulating capital, but it's really what it refers to is this idea that making money is the main point of your economy. It's the reason you operate it. The role of advertising in this is, I guess, kind of like major supporting actor, if you like. So if the main reason you produce stuff is because you want to make money, a key component there is that you have to sell it. It's no good just kind of producing all these things and then letting them sit there, because until you've made the sale, until somebody's given you the money for it, there's no purpose to that production from like the capitalist point of view. And so the role of advertising in a capitalist economy is to help that conversion happen, is to take the stuff that you've made and that kind of sits there in your warehouse, for example, and turn it into money by convincing people to buy it from you.
One argument that we often hear from the ad industry is that advertising doesn't make people buy things necessarily. All it does is help people choose between comparative brands, right? So one supermarket versus another. But ultimately, you're only going to shop at one, once per week or whatever it is. So on the whole, and I guess it's like the ad industry trying to cover its own backside against scrutiny. But the argument being there that there's no extra kind of, as it were, growth happening. It's just one customer choosing between one brand and another because of advertising. So I wonder, do you think that argument holds up to scrutiny?
I mean, basically, no. But say a bit more. I mean, so there's quite a bit of research in consumer research and psychology that links exposure to advertising to increases in materialistic values. So
Mm.
the idea that what you value is um, having these kind of external things. So rather than focusing on kind of your internal quality of life, you focus on external products and validation as a way to get that. And like so yeah, so there's this kind of psychological work, and it's both there's some empirical and some that's kind of theoretical that shows particularly or argues particularly that with children as they're exposed to adverts and advertising, they develop this kind of materialism in their values. They become more materialistic, and then that leads them to want to consume more and buy more.
Mm.
Um, but we can, I think, go kind of beyond this kind of psychological frame, and if you do that, I think the idea of advertising just presents this kind of very simple this brand or that brand is uh, it just misses the bigger picture. And I think to be fair, that it could be intentional, it could be intentional, it doesn't really matter. But we know that capitalism it wants to make more money, and as a route to this, it tries to sell more stuff. And like this is not a new idea. So you have, I don't know, going back to like 1884, you've got William Morris, who argues that in order to make more money, capitalists have to sell a mountain of rubbish, things which everyone knows are of no use.
Mm.
Um, and the idea, there's now lots of analysis that builds on this, which basically shows that most media, most culture gets subverted by capitalism towards that end of producing more money, growing the size of your economy. And you can think about like my own economic sector, so education, universities, as being kind of part of that. And universities, I would argue, are kind of a couple of steps removed from the kind of that base capitalist logic of growing the economy relative to advertising, where the core message is buy this thing. At least in principle, university education isn't quite so naked in that kind of pushing that narrative. But it is more or less where we now are, which is that most students go to university to get the degree, to get the job, to work in this kind of capitalist setting. So the idea, I suppose, that adverts and advertising are somehow impervious to or resistant to this core capitalist logic when most other forms of culture are not, seems to me to be like naive in the kind of the extreme. I suppose a kind of maybe a more succinct way to say this is that like I think there's truth to the idea that adverts aren't the sole or even the main cause of increasing consumption, but they are key. They're a key part of that dynamic. They do promote this idea. Does that make sense?
I think that does make sense. That does
Yeah.
make sense because it reminds me of uh, in that piece that I mentioned that you published last year. You know, you developed this idea of like, well, kind of contrasting advertising today with like the Soviet realist art of the 20th century. So you know those kind of classic images that you might associate with the Soviet Union of people staring off into the distance, you know, with a big flag waving in the background. Um, and I guess that is that the idea that you're kind of talking about there of how advertising it creates its own mythology almost. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. And this is like, I mean, so the idea, so the Soviet realism example, it comes from the work of a sociologist called Michael Schudson. And he contrasts Soviet realism with capitalist realism, which is a term people might have come across with the work of Mark Fisher, who kind of popularized
Okay.
this term. But it starts with, or its academic usage starts with Schudson, and he explicitly argues that, yeah, what advertising does is sets up these kind of core values of capitalism as being like normatively good. So the key one being this idea that the way that you realize happiness, the way that you live a good life, is by buying stuff. So it's a kind of core consumerist message. And he argues that like the way that capitalist realism works for advertising is by creating this kind of link between reality and then this myth. So that's where the realism
Mm.
part comes in. So the idea is that any given advert has like things that you can connect with, things that are real and that make sense to you, but then they get kind of twisted and subverted to link into this core myth that you want to consume something in order to make your life better. A nice example of this, well, nice example, you know what I mean? It's a good example in terms of illustrating the point.
Yeah.
It's like there's a, an espresso advert which shows this kind of interaction between a mother and son. And the core part of the advert is the son gifts the mother this kind of big fancy espresso machine, and she looks at him with this kind of real look of affection and love. And like the reality here is that, you know, you can put yourself into that situation. You can imagine this exchange of giving your mum like a gift on her birthday, and you know what kind of reaction you're looking for. The myth is that the giving of this big expensive Nespresso product creates this relationship
Mm.
with your mother. Um, and it's just not true. This kind of buying and selling is not a good way to create meaningful relationships with people that are important to you. Um, I mean, another example, one that's in the paper you mentioned at the start, is when I used to work in Salford in Manchester, and I used to commute there from Doncaster, so it took me ages, and I was on the train, and I photographed this billboard, which it was for some kind of Vauxhall 4x4, and it says cattle class, first class, and there's a picture of the car, right? And the reality here is like the elements of reality are that there's a car, it's a product, you can buy it. Also, there's an element of reality to the cattle class. Like those trains were horrendous. I was jammed on them with like loads of other people. It was uncomfortable. But the myth is the idea that, you know, the way you solve this is by buying the car. And, you know, it's this car is like the embodiment of freedom. It ignores all the kind of the hassle that comes with having the car, you know, when it breaks down on you when you're sat in traffic
Mm.
on the M62 or whatever. All of that is missing. It presents the car as this kind of mythical solution to your problem, and it ignores other more realistic solutions like better funding public transport and expanding the train network, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Like the advert exists in that one little moment
Yeah,
when, like you say, you're a commuter on a train and you're frustrated
yeah,
about that, and you see the advert that makes that message of
yeah,
that it matches your frustration and offers a solution. But like you say, it conveniently forgets all the frustrations that would come through that product as well.
yeah,
And I suppose it's not just that those frustrations, not just for you in terms of owning a car, but for the planet, for
yeah.
society, and everything else. Is It's all excluded from the world of the advert, from the language of the advert, right? They never talk about the downsides.
Yeah, I mean, that particular advert I think is kind of interesting as well because it demonstrates, I think you sometimes get this conflict between kind of advertising and more democratic modes of change. Just so specifically in that case, when that advert was displayed, when I photographed it, it was 2019, and at that point, Salford sort of city council was consulting on its climate action plan, and big parts of its climate action plan were about reducing car use in the city, about increasing public transport, and you actually, in that case, then have this advert which is using money from a large company like Vauxhall to essentially undermine those public goals.
Mm.
Um, it's existing kind of entirely outside um, these more democratic channels.
And I think for local authorities as well, or local councils, again, that idea of the bigger picture, because if you're advertising, it's not just cars, but junk food is a great example, or gambling, things that really harm people's health. That has a cost to that local council, right? In terms of the NHS spending, or the cost of ill health that puts onto local authorities as well as the country as a whole. Again, kind of gets forgotten in the conversation here. You're right. I mean, ad-free cities, we speak a lot to local authorities about more ethical advertising that they could prioritize, and it often comes down to a financial argument of revenue from advertising space versus, as they see it, losing that revenue. But then we try and make the argument, but there's a cost associated with this. If you're advertising junk food to kids, right, you're going to have a generational health burden. And yeah, I mean, perhaps that leads us on then to chat a bit about um, degrowth. And yeah, I mean, there's I know a bit of debate about that word itself, and maybe we can touch on that. But just for now, like your work in this area is grounded in ideas of degrowth or post-growth. So yeah, maybe just for listeners who are perhaps unfamiliar with those ideas, could you give us a brief introduction?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, degrowth and post-growth, to an extent, they do, or they are about kind of what they say on the tin, to use a kind of advertising idiom, um, which is they're about centering the idea of growth and problematizing it. So, saying, do we need to grow? What is the problem with growth? And is it desirable? So, most of it kind of is originally rooted in ecological economics and the work in particular of a guy called George Rogan and then later Herman Daly, who basically said that all economies are fundamentally physical, material, right? So every piece of economic activity that you do requires material inputs, it requires energy. Some of this is obvious. So we're speaking over Zoom on a laptop. The laptop is, my laptop certainly is made of metal and plastic, like it's got these physical components. That metal had to be like dug up, heated, transformed. It's very physical. But it's even there in like things which you think of as being like, well, we typically think of as being like less materialistic. So I don't know if you go into like healthcare or education, we often talk about these as services, but like education typically happens in a building. You've got books, you've got computers. Again, there's all this kind of material inputs. So the fundamental point is that the more stuff you produce in an economy, the more materials you have to use, the more energy you have to use. So you do become, or we have historically become more efficient over time in terms of our economies. So uh, you look back 100 years, 200 years, every item we produce, every pound of economic value that we produce uses much less energy, much less material than it used to. But overall, we use more materials, more energy, emit more carbon emissions because we produce so much more stuff. So you can think
Mm.
of that as like there's an efficiency effect and there's a scale effect. And certainly historically, the scale effect has been so big as to like vastly outweigh any efficiency gains.
Is that Jevons paradox? Is that what it's called?
Yeah. It all feeds into Jevons paradox. So Jevons paradox is kind of central to this. So the point is that as you become more efficient with resources, you might end up using more of them essentially because your economy kind of pushes you to use those resources because they're cheaper. So
Mm.
we see this like so I had a paper out recently where we looked at kind of a history of energy use from sort of 1800 up to the modern day, and looking at this question of energy efficiency. And again, you see the same thing as we become vastly more efficient with energy over time, but we use more and more energy.
Mm.
And so weirdly, what happens is that you've seen these kind of real big growth and spikes in like renewable energy over the last like, I don't know, 20, 30 years, but that hasn't decreased fossil fuel use at all. It's just stacked on top of it. And so the argument we make in that paper is that essentially it's capitalism constantly wants to be producing more stuff. So if you become more efficient with energy, you become more efficient with materials or resources. You don't save that stuff. You just channel it into production somewhere else.
Mm.
Um, and to bring this back to advertising, like the role of advertising is to give you a way to monetize that, give you a way to kind of give you a reason to keep producing. But I guess all of this is part of a kind of the ecological critique of growth, is that if what you want to do is reduce the total amount of energy that you use, reduce the total amount of carbon that you emit, total amount of materials that you use, you can't just focus on becoming more efficient. You have to deal with the underlying pressures, the underlying logic, which means that every time you become more efficient in the last 200 years, you've channeled that into more production
Mm.
somewhere else. And so degrowth and post-growth, and to an extent the well-being economy as well, all say, okay, if this has historically happened, perhaps the problem is growth itself, and how can we manage an economy that doesn't grow? And then from that starting point, this kind of ecological critique of growth, people have also begun to look at kind of social critiques of growth. Say, is growth delivering the social benefits? Because the argument has always been that you want growth because it delivers these social benefits. So they're kind of implicit in like most economics, and like in the UK Labour Party's current kind of growth platform is the idea that as you grow, you get richer, and as you get richer, your life just improves in a variety of different ways. And then there's most of the social critiques of growth, perhaps unsurprisingly, are just that that's the evidence for this is quite weak. So simply becoming richer doesn't necessarily make you peer. And then degrowth and post-growth, I guess, are combining these two pieces to say, okay, so we know that growth is, or at least historically, has been bad for the environment, and it looks like it's got very limited social benefits, at least in wealthy economies. So can you have an economy that doesn't grow? What would that look like, and how would you get there?
Do you think there can be advertising beyond, growth with a capital G? And what would that look like?
Yeah, I suppose it depends how you define advertising. So I guess if we're splitting it between advertising or adverts and promotions, then I guess probably not.
Mhm.
But certainly there's a role for promotions in a world beyond growth. I think there's this body of work called sometimes it's called community economies, sometimes it's called diverse economies, sometimes it's called post-capitalist economies. But the idea is that there are loads and loads of different reasons that people produce things, and most production under capitalism is motivated by money. That's the key reason that things get produced by capitalist organizations. But even so, there are like lots of organizations which have like non-capitalist impulses, or there are community groups, there are things like the NHS which are producing things for fundamentally other reasons. And there's no reason why you you wouldn't promote some of those reasons. So imagine that I was going to say local community group, it could be a national or international effort to like improve ecosystem health by going out and planting more trees or doing conservation efforts. There's no particular reason why you couldn't promote that. You couldn't advertise that to people and get people engaged in doing that kind of work. But that's kind of a fundamentally different role for advertising, I suppose. That's about promoting activities that are environmentally and socially beneficial rather than trying to get you to part with your cash.
In a recent episode of the podcast, we spoke to Ruth Taylor from Common Cause Foundation, who does lots of work on values, cultural values, and we spoke to Ruth about how values are used in adverts, and how that's changed over time. And I think it's really interesting that, like, traditionally, perhaps adverts played on what we might call extrinsic values. So it's like, buy this product and you will look cool or you'll look successful. People will like you. And adverts today kind of, not all the time, but sometimes play to more intrinsic values. So it's like, the Nespresso example of buy this to show your love, right? Or it's buy this product to show how much you care about the planet. Um, and so, it's adverts quite explicitly promoting values that we would associate with a post-growth economy or a well-being economy. So I just wondered, like, how do these two things fit together? And, is an advert promoting, Coca-Cola or whatever it might be, as somehow a means to social cohesion or somehow a means towards community or love or whatever it might be? Is that compatible with these kind of other economic ideas, or is it fundamentally problematic just by the nature of the brand itself and what they're selling?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the classic Coca-Cola teach the world to sing advert, right? Or like, was it for Coca-Cola or was it for Pepsi? The one that really irritated me relatively recently was the kind of Beyonce Revolution kind of themed advert. Do you
Yeah,
know
yeah.
which one I mean?
Pepsi with
Was
was it
it Pepsi?
Kendall
Yeah.
Jenner?
Oh, was
Right.
it Kendall Jenner? Okay, right. Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
thinking of the same one. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Which like the idea of like what we need is social change and big systemic social change is like, yeah, I'm on board with the message. But I think what's problematic about it is that you're not going to achieve that by buying a can of Pepsi, and you're not going to achieve world peace by buying, a six pack of Coca-Cola. It's just fundamentally, I think the fundamental message actually doesn't really change. It doesn't really matter whether the advert is trying to um, convince you that buying a certain product will make you cool, or whether it will, I don't know, generate world peace or social cohesion.
Mhm.
Fundamentally, consumption of products just doesn't do that. We achieve these things by going out and engaging with each other and building communities and doing the kind of political and advocacy work on the ground. So in a sense, I think these things can be more harmful because there's a risk that you buy it, certainly in terms of like green consumption, you go and buy the electric car or the meat-free burger, and you think, right, my job is done.
Mhm.
And actually, the job really is not done because you maybe you've freed up some petrol. It's not going to be used on your commute, but the likelihood is it will be used somewhere else. So you have to change the system, and you can't do that by partaking in the system. You have to kind of change the rules of the game.
Mm. Our power to change things through consumption is always limited by
Yeah.
the limits set by the companies in control of consumption, who have no interest, no, who certainly have a vested interest in keeping things as they are, on this sort of growth with a capital G model, which, as we know, is ecologically and socially unsustainable, to put it lightly. So just a final question then, Simon, is do you see signs of hope or potential for a future beyond this kind of corporate advertising?
Yes, I'm sorry. So, I mean, I don't know about you. I often find like with people that work kind of in these kind of, I don't know, I say I work in like sustainability space. I find the cycles of hope and despair. There's moments when you feel really optimistic, moments when you don't. And I'm afraid you are sort of catching me in a moment when I'm like, keep doing all this stuff, and the wheels just keep on turning. Um, but yes, I do think there are some reasons to be hopeful. I, in a weird way, the things which give me hope at the moment are Trump and sort of weirdly Farage. And I want to please don't cut that and use that as a kind of a promotional
Sure.
point because it's like what I think is kind of interesting there is in ways that, to be absolutely clear, I do not agree with. Um, I think they're kind of showing possibilities for a scale of social change which I think that more sensible politicians have not felt able to kind of promote. Um, like I thought it was really interesting that in a way, what kind of Trump's agenda is in many ways much more destructive and radical than, say, Liz Truss in the UK. But actually, he's kind of survived in a way that she hasn't. So I don't know what the lessons to learn are, but it does kind of give me hope that actually there is appetite out there for more radical change. It's just about it's about what form that radical change takes and how do we learn lessons from this. Because and thinking about our discussion here, like I think the idea that you would say ban advertising or put extreme limits on like capitalist forms of advertising feels like something that you could just not really, it doesn't feel like it's got political traction. But I wonder if actually what we need to do is advertise it in the right way and
Mm.
find the connection to, whatever it is that's motivating your reform voters and your Trump voters. Which I think there are like ideas there about control over your life and autonomy, which do connect to kind of critiques of capitalism.
Mm.
Uh,
All right, a slightly a circuitous route to
Yeah,
change.
yeah, but yeah.
Progressive change via Trump.
Because yeah, I'm not. I'm no. I mean, I'm not. I'm not some kind of sort of accelerationist. I'm not promoting the kind of the collapse of
No,
the
no, no.
complete collapse of the global economy via Trump to create change. But I do think I do think what's held us back a lot has been this kind of sense that it's kind of an inherent conservatism of the political system where you don't want to try and drive too much change because you lose your seat or you know um advertisers won't work with you and you lose your revenue. Um, and actually, I think there's a sense in which there are bigger changes that are possible, and that's fundamentally what we need.
Simon, it's been a fantastic conversation. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for joining me on Better Without Billboards.
No, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Better Without Billboards podcast. As always, you can find all episodes of Better Without Billboards on Acast, Spotify, YouTube, and most other podcast platforms. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.